Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 7th webinar of the ODA Learning Series 2020, co-organized by UNDP and OECD, and to the second Green Finance webinar out of 3 webinars dedicated to green finance, co-organized with the Ministry of Finance of the Slovak Republic. My name is Sarah Selenge. I am very happy to welcome you all and greet you all from the Istanbul Regional Hub. Let's see if we can see more videos opening up to say hello to people, or at least to wave at people. Hi, Veronica. Hi, Sydney. I'm not going to probably be a hi, Peter. I'm not, I guess, is that Prague? I guess, right? I cannot say hi to everyone, I guess, with the names. So we had a lot of people, over 100 people registered, but now I see there's about 40, but I think we should still start and not wait, considering we have a very exciting presentations coming up. So last week, we had our first Green Finance webinar where we had Juan from OECD. I don't know if Juan is with us today, but he was reminding us why we should be talking about green finance when we are talking about ODA in our series. And then we also had Anna from EBRD who shared with us very concrete examples of how financial institutions are contributing to the green transition. So basically, last week, it was very clear that we should be forging partnerships and that we should be very creative when it comes to the ways we can finance development. So we will basically pick right where we stopped last time, and we're going to dedicate the whole webinar today to green bonds, as announced previously. Those of you who attended the Green Finance workshop last year in Bratislava, you may remember, or you may not remember, that we had an introduction to green bonds. Our colleague Max Riva introduced it as an instrument that we could raise private finance for nature. And this topic received a great interest from donor countries, and that it was really interesting because it was a question both in terms of the domestically and both also in terms of supporting partner countries. That's why we are revisiting the topic, and we have 2 wonderful speakers with us today. But before we start with the agenda of the day, I wanted to ask you to introduce yourself. No, joking. A very quick poll question. Can we have the poll, please, Kubra? Just so that we know who's in the room, and it may actually be very useful for our speakers, where they can focus more. So, how do you rate your knowledge of green bonds? Are you an expert, or do you know more or less what it is, or you are very happy to learn today what green bonds are? Let's take a moment for that. All right. Apparently, we were doing the polls very fast, so now we're going to be very, very great. Wow, that's the spirit. We're all looking forward to learn today. I mean, most of us. There is it 3%? How many people, Kubra, is expert? Can you see?
Only one person.
Only one person in the room.
Yes.
Great. All right. So we can learn from the one person, the rest of us. No, joking. You'll be probably very surprised that actually we can learn from all of us, from each other on this and other topics. So today we are very privileged to have 2 speakers who are going to share experiences from 2 different continents. That is the beauty of UNDP, because literally we We are on the ground around the world in almost 170 countries and territories, helping countries achieve sustainable development. And we are accumulating a lot of experience and lessons learned that we think could be very valuable when it comes to green bonds, as you contemplate the pros and cons. And perhaps also when you hear your counterpart asking you next time whether you could help them issue green bonds, maybe you would know what it entails. So this is what we're looking forward to discuss today. And our colleagues, can we see the, okay, never mind. John and Bruno, connecting today from Indonesia and Zambia, are going to share. Joan is going to give us a bit of a recap from last year for those of you who haven't joined us, or those of you basically who answered the question C in the poll. She will give us a recap of what green bond means. And then we will have Bruno sharing experiences from Zambia, what we should be mindful of, focusing on the pre-issuance stage. And then we will go back to John. So it's going to be a little bit of a dance, who will share with us case study from Indonesia with green sukuk, focusing on the post-issuance stage. So I think it'll be very, very informative, and probably I would suggest to concentrate the Q&A at the very end after we have all the presentations. But please do feel free to type in your questions in the chat box during the presentations, and we can come back to it afterwards. So just a very brief introduction to our speakers, because you can find a detailed one in the flyer that Oni just shared, as well as you probably received it in your email. So Joan is our regional advisor in UNDP Indonesia's Innovative Finance Lab. And she provides technical advice on finance in the SDGs for Indonesia, for Asia Pacific, and obviously beyond the region, as you can see. She's been supporting countries in Asia Pacific to strengthen planning and budgeting systems and implement public finance reforms that incentivize climate action over the past 6 years. And Bruno is a development finance expert, chartered accountant with expertise in green finance, including project finance, with over 17 years of experience. And he's been the country team leader for UNDP's Biodiversity Finance Initiative in Zambia over the last 4 years. And Bruno is currently leading the development of Zambia's green bond market, which includes customizing fiscal and non-fiscal incentives that could support Zambia's green growth agenda. All right, so without further ado, let's start. Joan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and it is a real joy and a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Can you all hear me very well?
Yes, we can hear you and see
Awesome.
you. Great.
Great, thank you. Greetings from Jakarta, and it's really nice. One of the advantages, I guess, of the COVID pandemic is being able to be in touch with so many people across the world, and it's great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you are. I'm Joanne Manda, as Saran mentioned, the regional advisor based here in Jakarta, working very closely with our Bangkok regional hub. And I cover over 8 countries in Asia Pacific, particularly looking at the issues of innovative finance. And UNDP hasn't always been involved in this area of work. So I'm really pleased that you did this poll. That's helped me to kind of see the range of the expertise and experience in the room. Let me start by confessing very, very quickly that I am not one and only person who clicked that I'm an expert. I think I was in the 3rd category. Just to give you some of the reasoning behind that is because, you know, I began my career in this kind of work, particularly focused on climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and then much more and more going in towards climate finance. And, you know, if you're coming at this subject from the sort of more natural sciences side, you've got a lot of passion around, how do we get climate finance to reach the poorest? How do we get climate finance to have an impact? And how do we really get climate action to happen on the ground? But without the language of finance, that's a really, really tough thing to achieve. And so my journey has been very much moving from the technical side to the financing side and understanding what do financing, people involved in the financial sector, what do they really look for? How do they talk? I mean, even basic things like that. Our vocabulary and language is so different. And so I've really had a very fascinating journey. And I see myself very much today as maybe an interpreter to some extent, helping to unpack the concepts and the thoughts and how we can really engage with the private sector, the financial sector, investors at large on this very crucial topic, and how we can then galvanize and start to move private capital towards achieving the climate change targets that we have, and in fact, more broadly, the SDGs. So if you go to the next slide, please. I think an important takeaway message certainly from last year's presentation from Max is recognizing that green bonds are a massive, massive tool. They are an easy way to move private capital, and certainly an easy way to move private capital towards climate action. The private sector is familiar with bonds. It's a tool that they know, that they trust, and us being able to then utilize it for the outcomes that are targeted towards climate change and towards the SDGs will be a real coup. So next slide, please. What does the green bond landscape really look like? And this slide I get from Climate Bonds Initiative, who are one of the premier institutions dealing in the subject of green bonds. And when you start getting engaged on green bonds, you understand that CBI are really doing an excellent job of unpacking this area and packaging data and information that is really useful for all stakeholders to really understand the landscape and also start to leverage this financing instrument. But from their website, you get this data here, which I've always found fascinating. As I said before, the private sector investors are very, very familiar with bonds. Governments are very, very familiar with bonds. In fact, you as an individual, if you've ever bought a house, would be familiar with the bond. And so you're looking at a global market of over 90 trillion US dollars, right? And that's the big blue square on the far right of this picture. But these are what we call vanilla bonds. This is money that's just going out, it's just debt. But if you could start to harness that debt and start to ask issuers to use the money that they borrow to achieve certain outcomes, you start to move towards a green bond market. And so far, the green bond market has been growing. And as of 2020, 1 trillion out of the 90 trillion is really labeled green bonds. And labeling is an important piece to mention here, because organizations like Climate Bonds Initiative have a taxonomy, and they have a tool for you to be able to really put a label. It's easier for marketing purposes to confirm that what you're spending the money on is actually on green investments. Because of course, there's still a lot of debate and even contention sometimes in defining what is a green investment. And so you have a lot of green programs out there that might not qualify as a labeled green bond. But you do have other type of climate aligned bonds as well, and even climate change bonds as they're called now. And as we go through the presentation, I'll be telling you a little bit more about the other kinds of bonds that are starting to emerge on the market. If you turn to the next slide, please. But the biggest point to say here on this slide was that it's a huge market. When we talk about the gap in financing as development corporation practitioners, we've been talking about 3 trillion, to achieve the SDGs, we've got a deficit of about $2 or $3 trillion. There's 90 trillion out there already functioning that we could harness. Okay, so now to this slide. Green bonds began growing as a debt instrument from as early with the World Bank as 2009, when the World Bank issued its very first green bond. Sovereign green bonds came onto the market a little bit later on, around 2016, 17, with Poland and France being the very first sovereigns to issue a green bond. But you can see that the jump has been significant, that countries, corporates, institutions are now really thinking about this as they are starting, as the conversation globally has been shifting from, doing business as usual and maybe ticking off your ESG, right? Your environment, social and governance aspects of your projects or of your business model, to really starting to take into account the impacts of climate change and also wanting to show some impact. And so that's how green bonds have started to really increase. There's a lot of investors who are now exclusively green investors. And so this has been what has been driving the green bond market. And you can see here that, in terms of the banking sector, and I know you probably covered this in last week's session, but green loans are going out now. And that's not the same as a bond, but it is, a similar concept. Sovereigns are issuing green bonds. You've got government-backed entities or parastatals who are issuing green bonds now. Local governments, particularly in the US, where you do have good fiscal decentralization in your countries, you can start to take on local debt at a local level and issue bonds that way. Development banks, of course, have always been doing this. And the one at the top, or at least if you look at this graph, in yellow is ABS, which when I first started working on this, I was trying to decide whether that was the Australian Bureau of Statistics, but it's actually asset-backed securities. So there's been a lot of work emerging around green bonds. So next slide, please. Okay. And I think green bonds, just to touch on many of you who are coming from the development sectors, we're starting to hear a lot more about green bonds from development practitioners who are beginning to understand. And I think this all began very much in 2015 with the Addis Ababa Development Finance Conference, where we began to see the role of ODA as being a lever or leveraging or a catalytic force to galvanize private investment. And I think this is where green bonds really come into play, where we as development practitioners can start to do small scale action that will actually leverage a large scale amount of money. And we'll come back to this particular issue around leveraging when we talk in the second half of my presentation. Next slide, please. But certainly green bonds are coming up, as conversations within the OECD and all sorts of other players, and particularly in the investment community itself. Investors are getting much more interested in investing with impact. And so green bonds are an excellent way of doing that. But what are the benefits of green bonds for issuers? Well, there's a range of benefits, and I think just to highlight a few from this slide, I tried to pack the slides a little bit so that after this session you can kind of digest. But when you are going out to get loans and financing, if you can get a diverse number and a diverse range of investors, that's a good position to be. That means you have the opportunity to negotiate, but also you have different investors with different objectives and different time spans. So you can manage your debt a little bit better. And that's a really important consideration when you are wanting to issue a bond. And so green bonds are allowing governments, municipalities, corporates to tap into new and a wider range of investors. It is possible to get a lower cost of capital when you issue a green bond, but this is a bit of a complicated and nuanced story. When you issue your bond on the market, it does go at market rates. So it's not concessional finance at all, and it has to be paid back. And in fact, when you first issue your first bond, you'll normally get just standard market rates in terms of interest rates for your payback period. But what happens with a green bond, because we're getting more and more investors who are willing to put their money in for an impact, you do get access to patient capital, at least that's what they call it, which means a person who's willing to forego returns over a bit of a longer time period. And that's actually really useful if you're wanting to issue a debt. Another thing about that is that we talk about the stickiness of a pool of investors. In other words, the loyalty. So if you issue one bond and you can show that it's green and people can buy into your vision and actually trust that you will deliver and deliver the impact that they're hoping to get in terms of their own portfolios, then you'll have a loyalty with your investors, and each bond that you issue afterwards, you know, you are not guaranteed, but you're certainly likely to have a high oversubscription for your bonds. And so you will issue a bond for, let's say, 500 million, 750 million, and you'll get buyers and you'll have enough people wanting to buy your bond that you'll be left over with people who weren't able to buy it. And that's an excellent place to be if you're issuing debt. If you turn to the next, oh yeah, just before we move to the next slide, I think it's really important in terms of the impact, especially for sovereigns. It's a really strong political message to put across that shows your commitment as a sovereign government, your commitment towards low carbon development, your commitment towards green investment. It's also really great moving into this sort of area because it's providing scale and liquidity to the green bond market. And also, you know, tapping, well, I've already mentioned tapping into new investors, but another really important point, which we are starting to see here as we're working in Indonesia, is the benefit of actually starting to grow your own domestic bond market and making that green as well. And that's crucial as governments are starting to need to show progress towards Paris Agreement targets, particularly through the NDCs. Next slide, please. That said, I mean, I gave you a very rosy picture, but it is quite expensive because let me just outline very quickly the difference between a normal vanilla bond and a green bond. A normal bond is, you know, I'm floating a debt, I will borrow your money for X number of years at a certain coupon rate or interest rate, and I will pay it back. And that's the end of the story. The investors put their money into your coffers. You make sure that you pay it back at agreed time spans and so on. With a green bond, you have to, at the beginning, be very clear around your messaging and particularly identifying potential projects and programs that will that you are going to use the proceeds or the money that you collect for the project that you're going to use the money for. And then over and above that, you have to get certain certification. You have to have a credit rating you have to have for any bond. So that's not a big deal. But there's certain certification that needs to come in place when it comes to a green bond. There's also special audits that need to be taken on an annual basis. And finally, there's a specific annual report to your investors that has to come alongside with a green bond. So there's additional, shall I say, additional conditions around green bonds that make it a little bit more difficult, maybe a little bit more expensive to issue one. However, once you've done the first issuance, then really you'll have set up the systems required for you to meet those requirements, and you can go ahead. And just to give you ballpark figures, because it does get quite expensive, aside from the figure, the fee that your underwriter takes, and that's standard for any bond. You also, on top of that, have to have a second opinion issuer who comes in and says, okay, I understand you said you're issuing a green bond, but I want to double check to make sure that what you're calling green is actually green. And I'll come back to that again. And then, and a second opinion issuer issues a second opinion just on your prospectus or the framework that you use to market your bond. And that kind of gives a stamp of approval, because of course investors need to see these kinds of, you know, branding and stamps just to show that I'm actually buying into an authentic piece, right? For example, in Indonesia, when we issued, when the government here issued the green bond, and green sukuk is what they call it here, because it's an Islamic bond, which is exactly the same as any kind of bond, except that it does have to meet Sharia principles, and you cannot invest in things that are considered haram, like, you know, tobacco or something. So it adds just another layer in terms of the requirements for the bond. But the structure, the financial structure is exactly the same. But anyways, for us here, I think we ended up hiring Cicero, one of the second opinion issuers, and they generally charge you up to about $200,000 or so dollars. So it's about up to your negotiation and your conversations. But that's the kind of ballpark figure. But once you've done it, you also have to hire KPMG or Pricewaterhouse or something in the first year, and again over the lifetime of the bond for them to do their verification and audit. So I mean, that's how much it will cost. But once you get through that system and you are going for repeat issuances, it gets lighter and it gets easier. Next slide, please.
John, I think we have to move to the next one.
Yeah,
all right.
This is my last slide. I was just wanting to raise this slide, and I think we'll come back to these issues, because just to say, I mean, these are the players that are involved in green bonds, and they are not our usual development stakeholders. They're hard-nosed private sector players who need a return on their investment. And so the language that we speak to them really does need to change if we're really wanting to understand each other and the objectives that we want to get. But I'll stop here and hand over to Bruno. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. And I think you mentioned many things already relating to Indonesia, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But I think it's a great point for Bruno to pick up on your previous slide about it is not easy or cheap about issuing green bonds. But I think, Bruno, the floor is yours. Let's come back to John. Thank you, John.
All right, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Great. All right. So yeah, my name is Bruno, advisor for BioFin Zambia here in Zambia. And I wish everyone could join us here in Lusaka, because it's quite sunny, bright day. So very good for everybody to be here. So anyway, like you've seen on this slide, we at BioFin here in Zambia, part of the outputs that we were supposed to do here in Zambia is to develop what is called a biodiversity finance plan. In trying to develop that biodiversity finance plan, one of the things we wanted to do is to do an estimation of the finance needs for Zambia's green growth strategies. And when we talk about green growth strategies, it's your NBSAP, your National Climate Change Policy and Implementation Plan, and the ones that are put here that we managed to quantify basically gave us these figures, 10-year average of about 9.7 billion finance needs. And then that translates to about 970 million per annum. The 2021 budget on environmental protection for Zambia for next year is roughly just about $47 million. So you actually see that that translates into over 900 million annual deficit just to finance environmental protection in its totality. Next slide, please. Yeah, now on the next slide, what you hear is the compilation of Zambia's budgetary allocation. So Zambia's budget system has actually about 10 budget functions, which includes environmental protection, which are put in yellow and red. Now, what you see there is a sustained low or very low budgetary allocation towards environmental protection. Just to fit here, I had to put just 12 years. And within these 12 years, what you actually see is that environmental protection on average has only received about 0.6% of the total national budget. Now, if you've done Public Finance 101, there's a plausible assumption that budget allocation basically denotes government priority over over a specific budget function. And if you agree with me on that assumption, that technically entails that given this low budget allocation, would implicitly say perhaps environmental protection has not been given such a huge priority from a financing perspective by the Zambian government. And beneath that, what you actually see is that I'm just trying to make a comparison of some budget functions, notably debt servicing. So we've got domestic debt interest. For 2021, the allocation is about 15.3%. External debt, that includes both interest and principal, it's about 23.2%. Dismantling of arrears, 2.3%. And then you can see also one of the huge subsidies on agriculture that we have called Farmer Input Support Program, getting a budget allocation of about 4%.
Bruno, we are having, I think there is a connection issue. Are you connecting with your tablet? Because that worked very well before. Bruno? Bruno? So maybe I think Bruno is having problems. I wonder if we should jump back to John's presentation. I think Bruno is connecting now from his tablet. Can we do that, John? Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine with me, and then we can go back to Bruno.
Yes, because looking at the time, I think it's great that if we just continue. Thank you so much.
I'll make mine a bit faster to give Bruno a chance if he needs to get through. If you go to slide 10 then, on my slide 10, just to say, this is just an example of the work that UNDP has been doing in the in Asia Pacific region, and working particularly with the Ministry of Finance.
Hello?
Oh, he's back.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about
Bruno,
that.
sorry, Bruno, are you connecting with your tablet?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because the previous one was really bad.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry, folks. It's this happens. So yeah, let's go back to Bruno's presentation, please, and let's
At the budget, where I was analyzing the budget, I think that's where we ended, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
Let's move to the next slide because we are kind of tight with time now already.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure. So anyway, so when we started, I was just trying to present, I think, the budget situation for Zambia. And I think one of the things that we actually realized when we were developing the National Biodiversity Finance Plan is that we needed to come up with different instruments that will actually enable us to augment government efforts in terms of financing Zambia's green growth strategies. And this is how we actually came about, with the green bond, market development agenda. Now, one of the things that we did was to actually do a step taking of the issues that were before us. And what you see, I think here is a list of the things that we thought were actually quite critical. And one of them is issues of awareness. And I put a green tick and a red tick in that. We've made quite some strides on that. But I think there's still quite a lot of room. And I think that got manifested quite recently when we made some proposals to Ministry of Finance for incentives. And what we actually did realize is that we had probably not done that much in terms of providing awareness to the key policymakers in this process. Because the natural instinct for anybody, either a policymaker, if they don't understand the instrument fully, is basically just not to adopt it. So there's need, I think, to provide quite a lot of awareness. And then, of course, the lack of local green bond guidelines and listing rules, I think, is one of the issues that does pop up. But there we have a complete green tick, given that with our colleagues at Securities and Exchange Commission and other stakeholders, we have now the green bond guidelines and listing rules that have since been gazetted. And I think Joanne also mentioned the cost of meeting green bond requirements. I don't need to go through the whole list. But that's one thing that we're actually still trying to grapple with. How do we lower the transaction cost for green bonds? Partially we've attended to that by reducing some of the transaction costs, especially from the SEC and the exchange perspective. But then there's still quite a lot of stuff that we still need to do to make sure that we reduce the transaction costs. And so this that I have provided here, also I think lack of green bonds, investors, that's another big one. So that's something that we still need to sort out. So where you see the excess is where we have actually not done a lot of work. I think I may jump to the last one, which is the sovereign ratings. I think Joanne also mentioned that that's quite critical. This is still a debt, instrument, fixed income security, that's still required to be backed by a very good, sovereign rating, or at least a rating of the instrument. Now you will see, and I think this is also in public domain, that Zambia has quite a huge, debt stock at present, and so with some negative, ratings, and we actually foresee that this is bound to be a potential challenge. But then we need to find a way of going around that. But it's an elephant in the room. Next slide, please. Now, these are the two critical incentives that we actually submitted to Ministry of Finance to try and sweeten, this instrument. One is on withholding tax, and one also on corporate tax. Now, I've put an X there because unfortunately, I think these were not adopted. We still have to re-strategize on how we can get this message home, because we dearly need to get these incentives, approved. We've actually seen from our colleagues in the region, like Kenya, these are kind of similar, incentives that they developed, and it helped actually to move the market. So this is still bordering on the issue of awareness that we talked about. We probably need to engage a bit more colleagues that really are the movers and shakers of these processes at that level. Next slide, please. Yeah, now that's my last slide, is on opportunities for emerging donors and of course any other donors that may be in the room. We've got 5 issues that I think we would want to be attended to. I think one is what has classically been called exchange visits, or twinning as it were. And I think the target should be on policymakers, financial sector regulators, security exchanges, and of course, potential issuers. I think this is something that is very critical so that people do appreciate just the mechanics of going about, these instruments. Then there's also an issue on green bond TA funds. Basically, this is to support what we call hand-holding and also to reduce some transaction costs. So that's quite critical. As soon as we have potential issuers, obviously the first cry will be that the transaction costs are too much. But I think in the infancy of the market, we need to help handhold these maiden issues. Then we're also talking about the resident tier resource for key institutions. I mean, if we can have some kind of specialized unit for sustainable and green finance established, try and handhold the government and different stakeholders, I think that would be great. We have a good example from our colleagues in Seychelles that have set up a biodiversity finance unit within Ministry of Finance. So we're looking at something like that. I think that would help, because I think expecting our colleagues that have just done what I would call plain vanilla finance to just have an interest in green finance, I think it's expecting too much. So we need some kind of specialization if we have to see, some movements in the market. Then there's one other critical issue also that would seek, tier support, which is on green finance tagging. I know what is common is climate finance tagging. That's what you find a lot out there. But then there's also biodiversity finance, tagging. I think we would want to monitor and track green-related expenditures in the national budget. If you're doing a refinancing, I think that becomes quite handy. And I'm sure Joanne will speak to that, because I know Indonesia did something like that. Then the last one is on debt financial engineering. Like I indicated, we have a debt stock of about 11.97 billion, and almost just over 3 billion is actually the Eurobonds. This has been a thorny issue for Zambia. And I think we'd want to see how we can bring some innovation on debt financial engineering, debt refinancing, debt for nature swap, doing a mix of these instruments to try and see how we can sort out this huge debt stock for Zambia. Because as it were, this is quite critical for us to be able to move over the green bonds issue. So I think in a nutshell, this is what I meant to present, and I'm willing and more than happy to attend to any questions that will arise. Apologies for that little glitch. I hope we've caught up on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno. That was very, very informative. And I think it's your slide, last slide especially raises so many important issues from debt to others. But I think we should move to the presentation of John, and then we can go to Q&A. Of course, please feel free to write your questions to Bruno in the chat box. Thank you, Bruno. Can we continue with yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Saran, and I'll really try to gallop through this one because I think it'd be great to have a time for questions. So basically, the government of Indonesia has a very strong commitment towards moving the economy to low carbon growth, strong commitments around sustainability, and they wanted to make a public political message, and that's why the green bond came up. They had already been working with UNDP, particularly around what Bruno was mentioning earlier, public financial reforms that try to integrate climate change into planning and budgeting processes. And that included instituting a climate budget tag into their national chart of accounts. Next slide, please. And so that allowed the government to really utilize this to create their national green bond and green sukuk framework. And the framework is essentially just articulating the government's ambitions around green and green bonds. And it borrows from national policies, national strategies, and then outlines how these policies and strategies will allow a government to select projects and programs that are going to be aligned with green outcomes. And so, as you can see from the framework here, it has 4 components, and that's a standard globally agreed framework structure. It talks about how we will use the money we raise, the proceeds, what is the process for project evaluation and selection, and for the government of Indonesia, it was the budget tag, which was already instituted into their ministerial, Ministry of Finance budget circulars and so on, and how to manage those proceeds, and that requires some work with sector ministries, and then the annual reporting. Next slide, please. And we, as I mentioned earlier, Cicero came and assessed this framework and gave what they call shades of green. That's their sort of brand. It tells you to what extent which projects that you've picked are really green, that's dark green, or relatively okay, and they might meet the grade. So all the way from dark green to light green. Next slide, please. And they're very, very strict about this, and they will tell you what projects will not qualify. And that's really crucial and important. I think this slide here is just to highlight just a couple of issues. For Indonesia, they've actually ended up now with a series of issuances, 2018, 2019, and the latest one was in March 2020 for an additional 750, which means that they've actually now raised $2.75 billion. And of course, when we're talking leverage as development partners, UNDP can really sort of proudly stand alongside the government and say, we've actually supported a government to raise that amount of money that goes straight towards national projects and programs, and that is important. Just another highlight here is to point out the difference. The government has selected to have the proceeds of the bond go towards refinancing projects that were already up and running or done, and that's easy to identify through their climate budget tag, and also in terms of financing new projects going forward. Now, this is crucial because this changes the way in which you must do your public financial management, because if you in order to identify new projects, you've got to have some way of tagging the line ministry's proposed programs as climate relevant or green. And that requires you to put a statement in your budget circular that the Ministry of Finance issues. It requires you to change what you're putting in your budget submissions from the line ministries. It requires you to change the shape of your budget negotiation meetings between Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, and Ministry the sector ministries, the line ministries, whether it's the Ministry of Energy or whatever. So there's a whole raft of work in the background around public financial management reforms that does need to take place. And if you're talking about issuing green bonds, if it was a company, a corporate that was issuing a green bond, this is very easy. A corporation organizes itself, manages its data, manages its information very, very clearly. A government, on the other hand, you know, you've got decentralization, you've got sector ministry mandates and so on. And government doesn't run business as business. They run programs, and some might work, some might not work. And so you have to start working on improving basic project management within a sector ministry. And that's a different kind of way of operating. And that's, I'll come back to that on the final slide in terms of how we as development partners can contribute. Next slide, please. I'm really trying to rush through. I think you'll have a chance to look at this as you go on. This is just, the next two slides are really just showing you what comes up in your annual report back to investors. And, you know, it looks like this in your annual report. Investors don't read thick tomes of, you know, lots of reports the way we kind of development partners do. They want 3-4 pages, nice pictures, and the top line messages. And so Indonesia has been able to reduce 3.2 tons of carbon dioxide. It's built 7.4 kilowatts of new energy, renewable energy. It's you know, impacted 2 million households in terms of, you know, benefiting from improved waste management, for example. So this is what it looks like in your annual report. Next slide, please. This is another example of what it looks like in your annual report, looking at it from a sector perspective. Now to the final slide. So what does this mean for us as development partners? And I think Bruno alluded to a lot of this in terms of his example of what they've been doing in Zambia. I should have put as the first thing here is advocacy. A lot of governments are still reticent, still wondering, what is this green bond animal? How does it really work? Is it going to cost me too much? You know, and I think there's a lot we can do in terms of advocating this. Now, this comes with a caveat, because there still needs to be some robust conversations around general debt management, right? Because you're asking government to take on debt. But the argument for green bonds is that you're taking on debt with a purpose. And I think that's a really strong narrative to share with the government. For Indonesia, when they issued their first bond, their debt to GDP ratio was around 30%. That's a healthy place to be. They had a BBB rating in terms of their credit rating by Moody's. And so it's a healthy place, and they could issue the bond. With COVID now, their debt to GDP ratio is going too far, you know? So we are having to now have a really robust conversation that says, I know you want to rapidly respond to COVID, but could you make it green? Could you make it SDG? And that's where the conversations really need to be going on. And then we should be helping governments to develop their green bond and sukuk frameworks. This is really crucial because it shapes the future of all further issuances. You don't redo a bond framework with each issuance. No, once you've created one framework that's gotten a sort of a stamp of approval from your second party issuer, second opinion issuer, then you can just keep issuing bonds based on the framework that you've created. So it's crucial to have that right to identify the kind of sectors that qualify and so on. Project identification and selection turns out to be extremely political because this is additional money beyond the public finance that you have. And every ministry wants to get a little bit of extra cash for specific projects. But how do you make sure that you are not only identifying the right projects, but you've got capacity within your ministries to deliver on the impact? Post-issuance, I think the biggest point to raise here is this institutional capacity strengthening. Here in Indonesia, we really found a struggle to try and get the ministries to remember that you're not going to be reporting back to the Ministry of Finance only on public expenditures. You know, and most government ministries are still being measured in terms of performance just based on the money you've burnt, right? Your disbursement rates or your expenditure rates. You now have to include impact. You now have to include, you know, monitoring measures that you probably wouldn't have done before. So there was a lot of work in the background, and this is something that you know, other development partners like the World Bank wouldn't normally engage on hands-on day-to-day, because this requires some real specific long-term TA to get ministries up to speed to report back to the Ministry of Finance with enough data and the quality of data that is consistent so that the Ministry of Finance can then create that report for the investors. And so we had to design an impact framework. We had to look at capacity building in a number of ways. I'll stop there because I think it's really important to get back to questions. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, John. I think this this really illustrates, I mean, there is so much work that needs to be done behind the scenes, and that we as development practitioners have a very important role to play. So yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. So who would like to unmute their mic and ask a question for either Bruno or John? Let's, yeah, please just go ahead. Actually, there's one question. It's Sukuk framework. What is it? It's a bond in Islamic finance, right, John?
Yes, sorry, I was just about to type my answer for that. A sukuk is exactly the same thing as a bond. And so for you to issue a bond, you need what they call a framework. The framework articulates, we are issuing debt. Anyone interested in giving us money, here's what we are going to spend it on, here's how we are going to spend it, and you can track it this way. That's essentially what your framework says. So that's what it is. So for Indonesia, they call it a sukuk because Indonesia is one of the largest Islamic nations, and they wanted to issue, they wanted to make two political statements. Number one, we want to do something about climate change, and then number two, we want to do it in an Islamic way. That's it.
Also, that there is a huge opportunity in the Islamic finance market, right? Which we can actually make another webinar just on Islamic finance. In fact, we have this week a delegation from Djibouti coming to Istanbul for exactly that topic to learn, you know, to have some more conversation. On that was on slide from Bruno's last slide, first point, to raise awareness and exchange, right? So that's happening this week. Yeah, who would like to? Yes, so there was a question about whether we would share the presentation. Definitely, we will share that and the recording as usual with all registered participants as well as on SparkBlue. Anybody have questions? Please unmute your mic and no questions. That is Berna, you have a question.
Saran, if no one has a question, maybe this is a repetition of what was presented, but maybe it's John to do that. Can we list a group of bodies which would actually be available in a strong, sustainable, good green finance, green bond structure? So we heard of a second opinion providers, we heard from Bruno, Green Bond TA Fund, etc. So which ones would, I mean, I think some of the slides actually alluded to that, but what might be good to really recap for our understanding.
Yes,
if possible. Thanks.
If you can pull up slide number 8, that really answers the question that you're asking, Berna. If you're talking about a sovereign bond, which is a government bond, you need the Ministry of Finance, particularly their debt financing, debt management department. Slide number 8, not this one, the number 8, which is kind of the last slide. Yeah, that one. So you need definitely within the Ministry of Finance, you are going to need the debt management department. So it's not just anybody in the Ministry of Finance, there's a specific department. And I think that's one of the big things. We spend a lot of time talking to Ministry of Planning. If they're separate from the Ministry of Finance, it makes it really hard to go in this direction because they don't have the mandate nor the power in the government to actually allow you to actually issue a bond at the end of your conversation. So you want to make sure that you've got the right partner, right? And it will be the finance department of any company. So if you're talking about a corporate bond. And then the next person you need to talk to is a financial institution. So for Indonesia, for example, we were talking with HSBC. You do need a partner issuer. And sometimes if you're doing a domestic bond, you might have your central bank, but that's not what the central bank does. You have the financial authority, which we are working with in Indonesia, OJK, which is the financial authority responsible for laying the rules and regulations for how the finance sector operates. That's an important one, especially if you want to start to encourage corporates to start issuing bonds as well. There will be rules and regulations. Also, if you're wanting to make sure that subnational governments can issue bonds, then the finance sector authority really needs to be there to make sure that they have the right rules and regulations that allow them to take on local debt, or otherwise it's sovereign debt that then gets passed down to the subnational level. So you have to think about the structure. So your partner issuer is what we call HSBC. So you need a financing institution, which is why when I clicked at the beginning, I didn't say I'm an expert, because they're the ones who actually do the actual structuring of the bond. How many years will this debt be issued for? What sort of book am I going to build? And when you say book, it's because your financial institution needs to know which investors they're going to approach, who is going to buy what portion of the debt, how much are you selling it for, and so on. So you have some financial architecture that's required. They're the ones who also make the decisions and think through, is it securitized debt or is it not? I mean, when you say securitized, is it tied to a particular assets that the government owns? So there's some deeper financial conversations that have to happen. For Indonesia, everything is securitized because according to Sharia principle, debt should not be issued for debt's sake. You don't just get a loan for a loan. It must be tied to an asset that will appreciate in value because they have an issue with interest rates. But that's another, again, technicality that you need to think about. So you've got the issuer, you've got the financial institution, and the financial institution usually takes on some of the risk of that debt by becoming your underwriter, right? And they will then charge you for that. And that's quite a significant amount. So for example, with Indonesia, they charge you something like 2% of what you raise. And that's a lot of money that sort of ends up with the financial sector. But that's part of the game. And then the next people are the investors themselves. So you have to have a really good little black book of contacts across the investment landscape. And then the final piece, which I think is really crucial, especially if you're talking to a government, are the line ministries that are actually going to implement the projects. They need to understand this is debt money. This isn't just government money sending you our usual public financial money. This is now debt money, and it needs to be targeted, and it needs to be reported back on, and you need to give me back this data and this information in order to be able to do that. And that actually takes a little bit of time. If you have a strong central government, that's easy. I mean, you can always do this desk study type, but you do want to start to build the capacity of your line ministries as well. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much. I think, this is a 1-hour webinar, which we intend to give you a good point where, good starting point where you can learn more, because as we can hear, it's quite a beast, no? I mean, I think everyone who is working on it knows. But I think what's more important for us, the points that you raised, John and Bruno, in terms of development agencies or development practitioners, there is a lot we can do. And also that I mentioned last time, our partner, Slovak Ministry of Finance, has a very strong portfolio on public finance management, and we heard very clearly how important that is also in this whole game. There are a couple questions in the presentation, in the chat box. Abraham, you asked, Bruno mentioned a number of challenges being faced in actualizing the project. What has been the experiences in other countries, and how have the authorities resolved those challenges? And there's another question from Sherife. Is there any development agency or other than JICA issuing green bonds? Who do you want to answer that? Who would like to answer that? Or the one expert in the room, if he or she is still there. No, joke.
Would love to find, I can maybe just jump in here very quickly.
Yes, please.
I think World Bank, ADB, those sorts of agencies, they do green bonds all the time. EBRD, they do green bonds, and they can do them on working with a sovereign government, or they can do them on behalf of sovereign governments. And then you've got a whole range of corporations that do this all the time. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think that was to the second question. Bruno, do you want to answer to the first one? Do you want to go?
Well, I think I'm implicated in that one. I think that's a colleague from Zambia actually who's trying to ask, like what have been experiences elsewhere. So I'm a bit prejudiced because he's my buddy here in Zambia. So maybe Joanne, you could just highlight specifically, I think for Indonesia, what were some of the biggest hurdles? Because like here, of course, the debt issue is a huge elephant in the room. And we see ourselves probably starting with more of corporates than sovereign. And then because there's quite a bit that needs to be resolved from a sovereign perspective. But I know for Indonesia, you went sovereign. I don't know whether you've even done any corporations. I think last time you and I discussed, yeah. So maybe just highlight very specific succinct experiences, yeah.
Well, I can answer with Indonesia in mind, but I've also got some experiences in other countries. So, for example, in Indonesia, the challenges, I mean, you do need a good enabling environment to start to issue bonds. And if you're talking sovereign bonds, then yes, the sovereign credit rating is crucial. And if you don't have a good one, then there's a bigger game to be played in terms of improving public financial management, improving the reputation of the government in terms of its debt management, in terms of, there's a whole range of issues there. The other challenges that other countries with relatively good sovereign debt ratings are facing is around having a pipeline of investable projects, right? If you don't have a good pipeline, then you don't look credible. And so it's hard for investors to envisage where are you going to put the money if I gave it to you. And I think being very clear on that is crucial. We have started working very much with the corporate sector as well. A lot of it is also just, advocacy. What is green? The conversations globally are moving from, we'll issue a green bond. We are issuing a sustainability bond. We're issuing a blue bond. Seychelles issued a blue bond. Mexico just recently issued an SDG bond. What are we talking about? What does this look like? Are these different animals or is it the same thing? The bottom line is it's exactly the same financial instrument. It's just the flavor you're putting on it, the types of indicators that you want to use. And UNDP is doing a lot of work around SDG impact measurements, impact standards that can now be utilized for broader SDG bonds. I know UNICEF last month was talking about creating a framework for child bonds. So, I mean, a bond can be given different flavors, but it's the financial instrument is exactly the same. So a lot of this is about comfortable enough to understand that it's not something new, it's not a difficult new animal. Everybody has been issuing bonds for sure. Governments have been issuing bonds since way back when finance became a thing. So it's not that bad. But those are some of the highlights, I guess.
Thank you so much. I think looking at the time, I think we have to wrap, and it was really great to hear from both of you, Bruno and Joan. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. There's a lot to pack, and I think the point that you mentioned, Joan, on we need to have pipeline of investable projects is a really good segue to our next week's webinar. We will have our colleague Charles to talk about bankable projects and what we can do to help prepare those. And we will have Aki from Convergence, who will share with us how we can blend finance, because again, we have to be creative when it comes to financing development. So thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you so much to all of you who joined us today. And we will see you next Thursday, same time. Yeah, if not before on Spark Blue. So please feel free to open your mics and say bye to your neighbors or hello to your neighbors. Bye.